Hi guys, my name is Kara and I will be talking to you guys about mood disorders today. While I was looking into comorbidity of mood disorders and autism spectrum disorder, I came across this article titled Pediatric Bipolar Disorder, The Child Psychiatrist Perspective by Mary B. Stebbins and Jacqueline Corcoran. In this article, 10 psychiatrists were interviewed about how a child could be diagnosed within the context of DSM-5 with bipolar disorder. This includes bipolar 1, bipolar 2, cyclothymic disorder, bipolar disorder otherwise not specified, and a new diagnosis called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. The article focused on ages newborn to 19. In the abstract, Corcoran and Stebbins focused on a rise of diagnoses of pediatric bipolar disorder and insurance being a barrier to care. They also focused on social workers helping to get a proper diagnosis for the children. In their next part of the article, stated bipolar disorder in children, they say that in the past decade, diagnoses increased tenfold. However, the symptoms that the children exhibit do not always match the criteria listed. During Corcoran and Stebbins' research, it was found that two symptoms, elation and grandiosity, were rare to find in children, if not found at all. So then they go on to risk factors. Some of the risk factors were the same as most disorders, so your socioeconomic statuses, your familial status, your household status, those are all going to be the same as other disorders. However, they did find that there was an increased likelihood if a child was sexually abused to be found to have bipolar disorder. So this is as high as 20% as compared to non-abused peers. They also had an increased rate if in the welfare system or if family had been diagnosed previously. In their treatment section, Corcoran and Stebbins found that medication used to treat adults were used to treat youth. 90% of the youth diagnosed and used medications, but only 60% of them had individualized therapy. Childhood and adolescent disorders and mood disorders work groups recommended bringing forth a new diagnosis into DSM-5. They called this the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and it's more relative to children compared to pediatric bipolar disorder criteria found in DSM-4 TR. So in this case, that would mean that they were getting a better diagnosis that was fitting all criteria instead of being like, hey, they have this symptom of bipolar disorder, but they don't show elation or grandiosity, which tended to be the case in the past 10 years. So in the roles of social worker and psychiatrist section of the article, Corcoran and Stebbins acknowledge that the psychiatrist is the main player of mental health for the children. However, the social worker is needed and an essential role for the child because they must know what's going on to ensure the best for the child. So the social worker needs to know what the psychiatrist is thinking when it comes to disorders, so they need to know where their views are and what kind of views they have. So that includes knowing their views on pediatric bipolar disorder and whether or not they agree with the diagnosis. In the survey itself, Corcoran and Stebbins acknowledged that their interviews mean almost nothing due to the sample size, but their first survey is intended to be a qualitative, exploratory survey meant to be a stepping stone in the ever-growing field. So they know that it's a small sample size. They understand that it means nothing at all when it comes to scientific research, but it is a stepping stone to them. So they used 10 psychiatrists with varying degrees of experience. I believe the lowest experience that they had was a year of experience. All interviews took place in person or over the phone and were recorded, except for one that had extensive notes instead. At first glance, this appears to be a scientific study. However, Stebbins and Corcoran give questions in which they showed the reader, and many of them seemed opinion-based. One of the questions given were, how do you think the new DSM-5 diagnosis of disruptive mood dysregulation disorder might change the landscape of children's mental health? A question that only seems to be answered as an opinion. So I don't see how they could answer it any other way, but I think that it's going to be this way. Corcoran and Stebbins state that the results are preliminary but could be used to develop a survey for future research studies that use a larger, more representative sample of board-certified children and adolescent psychiatrists to determine if these themes are supported. So they're using it as kind of a baseline for their study. And then their point of view seems to be that there's a misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis of pediatric bipolar disorder. However, with this new diagnosis, children are more likely to be placed in a category now instead of just being placed into a category that doesn't represent their needs. Part of the reason why there is such a big misdiagnosis, however, is that the fact that many insurance companies, and especially in the states where this survey took place, they need to have a diagnosis in order to treat the children. So if they don't have a diagnosis, then they don't have a reason to pay for any type of therapy, which is what they found. So the new diagnosis will help families get needed care, as many times insurance companies require a diagnosis that corresponds to the treatment regimen. This could be the reason behind misdiagnosis, because insurance companies would be a barrier to care. And then finally, there's the strengths and weaknesses. As someone in the human caring field, I see where the strengths are coming from. I understand that there is flaws in the insurance system. Not so much in Canada, but definitely in the States. I understand that many of the insurance companies have regulations that need to be put in place to ensure that the children get the care that they need. It makes it harder to get the treatment and diagnosis, however, because they often need it to match the symptoms. So with this new disorder, there's going to be more of a match to the symptoms. They also discuss how parents come to psychiatrists either pro or con medication, and oftentimes they need to be re-educated. That was another thing that Stebbins and Corcoran really focused on. A definite weakness of the article would be the lack of sample size. 10 psychiatrists means almost nothing at all in the grand scheme of things. This is true for any sample size. I understand that a lot of sample sizes are smaller, but 10 is just, it means nothing at all. Another thing is that in the article they often used samples or other articles and papers to prove a point. At one point, Stebbins and Corcoran used a percentage and said that 11% of all pediatric bipolar disorders had confirmed cases in the Virginia welfare system. But 11% of what? 11% of 100 confirmed cases, 11% of 1,000, 10,000. Without that number, yes, it's scary, but it means nearly nothing at all when you don't have the confirmed cases. So overall, I agree. Misdiagnosis does nothing for the youth that we support. We don't know where we're going with that. We don't know what they need if we're not getting the right diagnosis. So for that purpose, I agree with DMDD being in DSM-5. The one thing that I would want to work on, however, is maybe having insurance companies not needing that diagnosis in order to give individualized therapy, because the individualized therapy shouldn't focus just on the diagnosis. There should be some form of therapy that could be given to kids that don't have a diagnosis yet. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.